So, first one is, guys, this is reality, okay? So, this isn't kind of supposition. According to a whole bunch of analysts, in this case it's Ovum here, this is the forecast for MPLS IP VPN revenue over the next 3 to 4 years, out to 2020. And the consistency is, this is pretty much every developed market. So if you look at the UK, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Netherlands, any developed country in Western Europe, graph pretty much looks the same. The North American graph is slightly behind that, but all the developed markets are beginning to show a decline in terms of the forecast revenue. And this is consistent across, I've looked at probably 5 or 6 of the main analysts, and okay, the numbers differ slightly, but the trend is consistent. And I think, for most service providers, certainly your strategy teams, your planning teams, I've no doubt they have access to this, they're looking at it, they're considering it, and of course, what are the implications of this? Because, often the MPLS service, or the services that run on the MPLS network are, the core data services, the core cash cow, if you wish, for many providers. So when you start to see graphs like this, sometimes the alarm bells start to ring, because this is something that, of course, people want to correct. And I think the key behind some of these as well, and I should have said this earlier, is from a Juniper Networks, I think from a Xantaro perspective as well, we have got a ton of, let's call it, commercial and intellectual property in the world of MPLS. It's one of the biggest areas of investment for us, one of the biggest kind of product areas, if you wish, in terms of capability. So we have a ton of skin in the game here as a vendor. This kind of has kind of alarm bells slightly ringing for us as well, because this is a major area that we've worked with with many of you and lots of service providers around the globe on building out some very large, very scalable MPLS networks. So to us, this is the work that we're trying to do, and certainly with PwC and others, is clearly it's in our interest. And I wouldn't say that's the case, and this is just my slight other vendor stab, if you like. That's not necessarily the case for other vendors. It is for us. So it's key for us that we're there to help, and we look at this and come up with ideas, come up with ways of helping you as providers kind of look how you turn that around. And I think if you look at the some of the details in the PwC stuff, on the positive side, it's how you kind of build and increment things that you do. Don't kind of ignore SD-WAN, because it's one of those things that could come back and bite you at some point. But look at it through the lens of there's opportunity here. Kind of embrace it. Again, for those of you that have that portfolio of VPN-oriented services, that's the kind of the sweet spot, if you like, for this as a technology. And that's where the kind of the opportunity, or the threat, if you wish, will kind of play itself out. Now, conversely, and of course you'd say, okay, so he's a marketer, there's always a graph that goes up to the right from a marketing guy. But that's actually from IDC, again in Western Europe, and the forecast growth in SD-WAN revenue for service providers globally, in this case in Western Europe. So again, whilst the current MPLS market is of course much, much bigger, this one starts to show growth, and it's relatively quick into growth, kind of 2016 to 2018. So it suggests, and you've probably already seen some big announcements from the likes of AT&T, Verizon, Orange. I saw BT went public last week as well. So you're beginning to see those kind of early announcements, which means people are beginning to go, either they're in deployment or they're beginning to kind of plan their deployment, and that's why you're starting to see that kind of kick in interest, or that rise in forecast revenue over time. So as ever, forecasts are forecasts. Sometimes they are bang on accurate, sometimes they are somewhat less than accurate. So to me, it's more the directional kind of trend, if you like, that's of interest. And I think certainly over here, I think most are in agreement that is likely to happen. The one on the right is, again, to be proven. It depends upon your view. But I think we're beginning to see some of those early talk about, early kind of press releases, early activities from carriers that suggest to me that there's some reality behind it. Now, I'm sure, sorry.
Is that vendors selling to service providers, or is that service provider revenues?
Yeah, good question. That's service provider revenue. Yeah. So we, of course, take a very small amount of that. But no, that is actually end revenue to you. So that would be from SD-WAN services going into market. And I think what's interesting here, guys, as well is, normally in all of my time kind of, working in this market and tracking it is the managed services market, or the propensity for enterprises to outsource services to a service provider, most likely the telco, is more prevalent here in Western Europe than in any other market. Yeah, it's ahead of North America, it's ahead of Asia Pacific. Difficult to know why that's the case, but it has always been the case if you look at the stats, that more enterprises have outsourced their WAN network to carriers here. So I think that's why we're beginning to see this maybe kind of, surge in Europe, possibly ahead of other markets. Again, that's just a Gainham view of the world, and take it for what it is. But that's, the correlation in my mind is, the European market, or the European managed service market, has always been ahead of the curve. And therefore, when major changes like SD-WAN appear, it will probably, let's say, impact or become visible here first, maybe compared to others. Yeah. But moving on. So the reasons behind the decline, guys, I don't think these are any, kind of massively insightful comments. So again, they're just part of the PwC argumentation, the things that they learned and the things that they gleaned from carriers that they interviewed is, yep, it's a highly mature market. There's plenty of competition there. You could argue it's saturated. There isn't room for much more growth on that kind of, let's get a vanilla service. And, that starts to cause price compression. It's a wonderful way of saying prices fall, because the competition in the market is sufficient, and therefore. So that's the reason. If you look at the kind of behind the ovum stats, the number of ports actually still growing, or the number of, let's say, connections to VPN networks is still going to grow, but the price per connection is going down. So the aggregate is, according to the forecast, that the revenue declines. Yeah. Now, so that kind of tells you this. It's a massively price competitive, massively competitive market. In the middle, then of course you've got people that are migrating to the cloud. Enterprises beginning to look at possibly over-the-top cloud providers. The rise of Amazon has been pretty phenomenal over the last kind of few years. Microsoft with their Azure service, IBM SoftLayer, et al. There's plenty of public cloud offers now where enterprises are beginning to put more and more trust in them. And I normally glean that from the fact, if you look at a lot of the kind of the UK government activities here now, they've adopted a kind of a cloud-first approach in many instances where, they're asking their departments to look to the cloud first as a potential before they bring it in-house. So that to me says that trust, if there was a kind of a line that said, the trust issue is still there, when public sector organizations, maybe not, kind of GCHQ and all of that yet, but the major kind of government groups start to look at cloud as a viable option for their IT services, it says that the trust is there. And I think that kind of reflected in, if you look at the cloud users here, leveraging 6 clouds on average. Seems high to me, but, again, that's from the PwC research. And then, of course, over on the right, this growth of SD-WAN, albeit it's still early, and again, I keep saying that, it's still an early kind of beginning, but the potential growth of that could start to eat into, of course, that's part of the forecast, may start to eat into the existing MPLS-based VPN market. Again, depends upon your view of all of this, but those are kind of some of the findings that the team from PwC came out with. And you'll have access to all the slides, because I know some of them, there's a ton of detail on them. And SD-WAN is, is kind of being adopted pretty quickly. Yeah? I think, again, this is an IDC study in terms of intention, of adoption. And I think the fact that, and again, this is just a Gainham comment, but, the fact that we're beginning to see those pretty aggressive RFPs beginning to hit from enterprise, because that's often the trigger, isn't it? Why would a service provider, I guess it's almost like not a challenging statement, but why would a service provider invest in technology that potentially lowers, the overall revenue available? Well, most wouldn't do that unless there was some pressure in the market. That pressure initially is going to come from enterprise, because they're getting the word in the market is there's money to be saved here. And then I think what you'll also see, and I think I missed one of the slides here, but you'll also see some over-the-top providers. Now, that could be Amazon, it could be Microsoft. I haven't seen them do it yet, but the over-the-top providers will see this as a way of kind of enhancing their cloud access service by saying to enterprises, why don't you just come onto our SD-WAN service straight to the Amazon cloud and bypass what you're currently using. So that is again, I hate to use the word threat, but it's one of those things that could potentially develop. And one of the slides that I shared, I put it in the deck, but it looks like we've kind of skipped it. There's a company called Ariaka, who I've never heard of before. Yeah? Gerald's nodding, he's heard of them. They are an SD-WAN over-the-top service provider. They're North American, no surprise. And the most interesting thing to me is the literature that they're putting out there. And it's incredibly aggressive. And I got a picture of one, and again, I've given it to Steve to send on to you. It's a public document, so you're very welcome to a copy of it. And it's kind of one of those 10 things. It's effectively targeting end enterprises and saying 10 questions that your service provider doesn't want you to ask. Yeah? And there's a picture of a guy in the front with his hands behind his back and his fingers crossed.